The camera beams its glare across the MSNBC studio, polished glass reflecting every tremor of tension in the air. Wow. Rachel Maddow's voice, usually measured, suddenly cracks through the silence, not in calm analysis, but in a sharp, uncharacteristic scream of frustration. Viewers at home blink in disbelief. Was this really happening on live television? Moments earlier, the discussion had been routine. Another panel debate. Another exchange of policy talking points until one Congresswoman, Jasmine Crockett, leaned forward with a steady gaze and delivered the kind of line that ricochets across a nation. With deliberate calm, she said, "The problem isn't that the truth is too loud, Rachel. The problem is that for too long, people like you decided who was allowed to speak it." The words landed like thunder. Maddow froze for a beat, eyes narrowing as if the force of that sentence alone had pierced her veneer. And then, breaking from her polished anchor persona, she erupted. Her voice rose, fists clenched above the desk, an audible scream echoing into millions of living rooms. The control room's alarms blared silently in the minds of producers. But it was too late. The moment was out in the open. Raw and unforgettable. Inside the studio, panelists shifted in their chairs, caught between shock and awe. Guess. Covered her mouth to stifle a gasp. Another shook his head, whispering under his breath. Online, clips of the clash were already being clipped, subtitled, and shared within seconds. The hashtags had begun to spark before Maddow even found her breath again. Crockett, however, did not flinch. Her posture remained upright, her voice unshaken. Her eyes fixed directly on Maddow, with the composure of someone who had carried heavier battles than this one. The silence that followed was deafening, an unspoken recognition that something seismic had just occurred. For a figure as towering as Rachel Maddow, losing control on air was more than a slip, it was a cultural earthquake. For Jasmine Crockett, it was proof that the underdog could seize the stage and shift the ground beneath the establishment. But what Maddow didn't expect was the viral eruption that would follow in minutes, an eruption that would transform a late-night broadcast into a political legend and propel Jasmine Crockett's words into the bloodstream of American debate. And this was only the beginning. Asterisk, to understand the magnitude of this clash, you have to rewind just a few moments before Rachel Maddow's uncharacteristic outburst. The debate was meant to be routine and exploration of voting rights, accountability in government, and the direction of American democracy. For Maddow, this was familiar territory. She has spent years shaping the liberal conversation, dissecting corruption with scalpel-like precision, holding power to account with her signature mix of intellect and biting wit. In many ways, she is the embodiment of establishment credibility, polished, informed, and unafraid to call out hypocrisy. But along with that authority comes a sharp edge. Those who sit across from Maddow know she can dismiss an opponent with a single withering remark. And that night, she seemed to expect Jasmine Crockett would be just another newcomer, another politician to pin down and outmaneuver. But Jasmine Crockett isn't built for dismissal. Born from struggle, rising through the trenches of law and activism, she entered politics not to preserve the old order, but to challenge it. She speaks in the cadence of community halls, not cable studios, on the urgency of protest, chants, not think tank jargon. When she takes her seat, she carries the weight of those who've been silenced too long, and she makes it clear that she's not here to play by the polite rules of Washington television. So when Maddow, with her characteristic mix of authority and impatience, attempted to pivot the conversation back toward her framing, Crockett didn't budge. Instead, she pushed harder, refusing to let the narrative be neatly tied up in Maddow's bow. The tension was palpable. Maddow's voice tightened, her tone sharpened. She leaned on her years of credibility, aiming to brush off Crockett's persistence as youthful bravado. But Crockett met her stare with the kind of calm that comes not from arrogance, but from conviction. What makes this moment matter isn't just the clash of personalities, it's the clash of eras. Maddow represents a generation of liberal voices that rose to prominence through television, through curated analysis, and carefully structured narratives. Crockett embodies a new wave, one shaped by grassroots organizing, viral clips, and unfiltered authenticity. Too many watching, this wasn't just Maddow versus Crockett, it was establishment versus insurgent, authority versus authenticity, the old guard versus the future. And in that studio, under the bright lights, with millions watching, the cultural stakes crystallized. Could the gatekeepers of political commentary still control the flow of conversation? Or was the era of the unpolished, unapologetic truth-teller finally here to shatter the glass walls of establishment discourse? As the exchange heated, the studio audience leaned in, sensing the tremor before the earthquake. Social media users, already tweeting out fragments of the dialogue, urged others to tune in live. "You have to see this," one viral post read. "Crockett isn't backing down." And then it happened. Crockett leaned forward, locked eyes with Maddow, and with surgical precision delivered a line so sharp, so undeniable that the entire panel froze. Asterisk. Long before the scream that sent shockwaves across the internet, Rachel Maddow was a rising force whose intellect and presence seemed untouchable. Born with a gift for analysis, Maddow carved her path through academia with the kind of sharp brilliance that turned professors into admirers and skeptics into believers. She earned her doctorate from Oxford, studying on a Rhodes Scholarship, cementing her place in a lineage of scholars whose voices often shaped nations. Even then, Maddow possessed a certain aura, a quick wit that could cut through jargon, and a confidence that carried the weight of inevitability. When she stepped into the world of broadcasting, she carried that same aura with her. At first on radio, then onto the screens of millions through MSNBC. Maddow became something more than a commentator. She became a cultural force. Her monologues were studied and sharp, crafted like essays, layered with historical context and biting observations. She didn't just report, she performed. To her loyal viewers, Maddow was the lighthouse in the storm. A voice who not only illuminated corruption, but also reassured them that someone, somewhere, still cared enough to decode the madness of politics. With intellectual rigor, for more than a decade, her show dominated liberal cable television. Politicians feared being on the receiving end of her scrutiny. Audiences leaned on her nightly dissection of power. Rachel Maddow was not just an anchor, she was a gatekeeper, defining what counted as truth in the eyes of her audience. Her credibility was her crown. Her sharp wit was her sword. Yet with that crown came the shadows that inevitably haunt figures of such stature. Maddow's very confidence, the same trait that inspired her base, often manifested as something harsher when challenged. To those who disagreed with her or worse, those she considered beneath her intellectual league, her dismissals could be swift and cold.
Ow.
A sarcastic smirk, a cutting aside, a rolled eye that told the world she had already judged and sentenced her opponent before the conversation even began. Over the years, younger politicians and activists began noticing this edge. To them, Maddow sometimes felt less like a mentor figure and more like a gatekeeper, someone whose authority was designed to reinforce the boundaries of who got to be heard. Her interviews often reflected this dynamic. Established figures were treated with deference, while newcomers found themselves fending off interruptions, condescension, or subtle ridicule. It wasn't cruelty, it was control. It's the kind of control that signaled, "I decide the rules of this table. You're here on my terms." This is why when Jasmine Crockett took her seat across from Maddow, the stage felt different. Maddow, with years of dominance behind her, likely believed this would be another debate she could corral, another fiery newcomer she could shape or silence. She underestimated what it meant to face someone forged not in Ivy League classrooms, but in courtrooms defending the powerless. In communities that didn't wait for permission to speak. The irony was that Maddow's greatest strengths were also her greatest vulnerabilities. Her credibility gave her authority, but it also locked her into the role of establishment voice. Her sharp wit kept audiences enthralled, but it also conditioned her to rely on dismissal rather than dialogue. Her confidence kept her at the top of liberal commentary, but it left her blind to the moment when confidence crosses into arrogance. For years, her authority had gone unchallenged in any serious way. Guests came and went, many too intimidated to spar with her at full force. But Crockett was different. Crockett was unshaken by credentials, unimpressed by television polish, unwilling to accept that gatekeeping was a prerequisite for truth. And Maddow, leaning on the very tools that had secured her dominance. found herself clashing with someone who couldn't be swayed by them. Rachel Maddow's story is not one of villainy, but of inevitability. She became the embodiment of an establishment. Liberal elite, intellectual, respected, and admired, yet prone to the arrogance of believing she was the final arbiter of political truth. To her audience, she remained a trusted figure. To her critics, she was the symbol of a gatekeeping machine that had long decided which voices were valid. And on that night, under the piercing studio lights, those two sides of Rachel Maddow, her brilliance and her blind spot, collided in spectacular fashion. She faced a challenger who saw through the armor of establishment authority and refused to be silenced, but that very confidence would be her undoing when she faced Jasmine Crockett. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot on the national stage. Before her words cut through Rachel Maddow's polished armor, she lived the kind of journey that reshapes how a person sees power. Born and raised in Dallas, Crockett was not surrounded by privilege or influence. Instead, she grew up watching her community fight for every scrap of dignity it could hold onto families, struggling against systemic barriers. Young people battling a system that often wrote them off before they had even begun. Those early years built her instincts, sharpening a sense of justice that wasn't abstract or theoretical, but urgent and real. Her decision to pursue law was no accident. Crockett knew that laws had been the very tools used to suppress her community, and she was determined to wield them instead as shields of protection. She became a public defender, standing in crowded courtrooms on behalf of those who couldn't afford a lawyer, those whose names the system never remembered. It was here that Crockett developed her voice, not the voice of cable television eloquence, but the voice of survival and truth. She learned how to face judges who didn't take her seriously, prosecutors who underestimated her, and clients who thought no one in the world cared about them. And every time she rose, she carried those battles forward. Her activism was just as fierce. Crockett walked the streets, protested in the heat, spoke in rooms where the air felt thick with disbelief that someone like her could demand space. She didn't wait for permission, she demanded it. Her words weren't rehearsed, monologues polished for applause. They were the raw reflections of lived struggle. In an age where politicians polished every syllable for donors, Crockett's voice rang out with authenticity. People recognized it instantly. Here was someone who spoke with them, not at them. When she entered politics, it wasn't because she had groomed herself for years as part of the establishment. It was because the establishment had left her community behind. She ran not on a promise of business as usual, but on the conviction that the halls of power must finally echo with voices they had long tried to silence. And she won not because of insider backing, but because the people who felt forgotten saw in her a mirror of their own battles. What makes Crockett remarkable is not just her resume. It's the way she carries it. In every room she enters, she brings her whole story with her. There's no mask, no pretense of perfection. She wears her scars openly, and instead of diminishing her, they elevate her. Rachel Maddow offers analysis polished by years of elite training. Crockett offers honesty sharpened by survival. Where Maddow exudes control and calculation, Crockett radiates passion and unfiltered truth. This is why her authenticity feels almost electric. She doesn't posture. She doesn't try to play the part of what politics says a congresswoman should look like. She is herself, loud when she needs to be, quiet when it counts, but always unapologetically rooted in the truth of where she comes from. And for audiences watching, that authenticity is magnetic. They don't just listen to Crockett. They feel her, against Maddow's establishment aura. Crockett represented something radical, the idea that expertise can come not from Oxford, lectures, or cable studios, but from walking alongside those who bear the weight of inequality every single day. Maddow's authority came from the power of institutions. Crockett's authority came from the power of people. And that difference mattered. It mattered because the clash between them was never just about two women on television. It was about two models of leadership, two ways of defining credibility. Maddow, the intellectual gatekeeper, spoke for the establishment's validation. Crockett, the unapologetic newcomer, spoke for the unfiltered voices of the marginalized. And when those two forces collided, the audience could already sense who had the moral high ground. Crockett's underdog arc made her victory all the more compelling. She had faced down dismissals before judges who rolled their eyes, colleagues who doubted her, systems designed to erase her voice. Every time she refused to bow, that same fire burned in her the night she sat across from Rachel Maddow. Her journey had trained her not to fear condescension, but to dismantle it. Every courtroom, every protest, every uphill battle had been preparation for that moment under the studio lights. And so, when she finally leaned forward and delivered her line, the one that would send Maddow into a scream heard across the nation, wasn't a rehearsed punchline. It was the culmination of a lifetime of refusing to be silenced. It was authenticity breaking through the polished walls of establishment control. Little did Maddow know, this newcomer had the sharpest weapon of all truth without fear. The debate had started in familiar territory. Rachel Maddow sat poised, her hands folded neatly on the desk, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had mastered this arena for more than a decade. She leaned toward Jasmine Crockett with that signature mixture of curiosity and skepticism, the tone she often reserved for newcomers. Congresswoman Maddow began, her words crisp, her cadence deliberate. Don't you think it's a bit naive to suggest that your brand of unapologetic rhetoric can move policy? Politics requires more than passionate, requires discipline, strategy, compromise. Surely you understand that. It was a classic Maddow maneuver. Framed the question in such a way that the answer seemed boxed in, forcing the guest to retreat or concede ground. But Crockett did not retreat. She didn't shift in her chair or fumble with notes. Instead, she looked directly at Maddow, her expression steady, her tone even. Rachel, she replied softly, the problem isn't passion. The problem is that too many people mistake silence for strategy. I refuse to play that game. Panel went still. Maddow's eyebrow arched, a flicker of irritation breaking her otherwise composed expression. She pressed harder. But surely you see, Maddow continued, her tone sharper now, that politics isn't about shouting in the streets. It's about winning votes in the chamber. It's about persuasion, not provocation. What good is fiery rhetoric if it alienates the very people whose support you need? Crockett's.com did not waver. She leaned slightly forward, her voice low but firm, her words carrying a weight that drew the room tighter around her. What good is persuasion? She countered, if it's built on pretending injustice isn't happening. If telling the truth makes people uncomfortable, maybe it's the comfort that needs questioning, not the truth. The words hung in the air. One panelist shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing down at his notes as though to avoid taking sides. Another stole a quick glance at Maddow, waiting for her to regain control of the exchange. The tension was no longer subtle, it was visible. Pressing against every inch of the studio walls, Maddow exhaled sharply, her composure slipping further. Her voice grew louder, her pace faster, as if sheer force could re-establish dominance. But you risk turning allies into enemies? You risk losing the fight before it even begins. That's not courage. That's recklessness. Across from her, Crockett did not flinch. Posture was straight, her tone unbroken. She did not mirror Maddow's rising volume. Instead, she held steady, the quietness of her resolve amplifying the contrast. Rachel, she said almost gently, I've seen what happens when people beg for allies who never arrive. I've defended them in courtrooms. I've buried friends who couldn't wait any longer for justice. If telling the truth costs me fake allies, then that's a cost I'll pay. For a split second, silence swallowed the studio. Viewers at home could feel the shift, the way the balance of power tilted. However briefly, away from the host and toward the guest. On social media, the buzz had already begun. Clips of the exchange were circulating in real time. Tweets read, Crockett isn't backing down. This is the moment. Watch Maddow's face. Hashtag swirled. Screenshots of Maddow's glare and Crockett's calm spread like wildfire. The panelists, sensing the storm, exchanged uneasy glances. One coughed nervously. Another shifted her papers, desperate to redirect the tension, but unwilling to step. Between the two women, the clash had become more than a debate. It was a duel. Authenticity against authority. Conviction against condescension. well, utterly rattled, leaned forward and jabbed the air with her pen. Her voice, now tinged with frustration, rose above the hum of the studio. That's not how governing works, Congresswoman. This isn't about feelings, it's about results. And your so-called truth will collapse the moment it meets reality. And then Crockett said the words that made Maddow scream. Asterisk. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Rachel Maddow's words still lingered in the air, sharp and stinging, but Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to reply. She didn't stumble, didn't retreat, didn't allow the host's volume to dictate her rhythm. Instead, she paused, deliberately, defiantly. She inhaled deeply, as if summoning the weight of every courtroom battle, every late-night protest, every moment she'd been told to sit down or wait her turn. The silence itself became a statement. Maddow leaned back slightly, her pen tapping nervously against the desk. The panelists darted glances at one another, sensing something was about to break. Even the studio crew later admitted that in that pause, the energy shifted. Crockett wasn't. Stalling, she was choosing her strike. And then, in a voice both steady and unyielding, Crockett spoke. Rachel, here's the difference between us. You've built a career telling America what's wrong from behind this desk. I've built a life fighting it face to face. You analyze injustice, I live it, and I fight it every single day. And I won't let anyone, not even you, tell me that truth is too loud. It landed like a hammer against glass. The panel froze. One guest blinked rapidly, as if unsure whether to applaud or shrink into their chair. Another shifted uncomfortably, realizing the power dynamic on set had flipped. Maddow's face tightened. Her lips pressed into a line, then parted slightly, as if searching for a retort that refused to come. The studio audience invited observers. Producers, even makeup artists, lingering in the wings, erupted into a quiet murmur that swelled like a rising tide. Someone gasped audibly. A cameraman, against protocol, whispered to a colleague, "Did she just say that?" Maddow tried to collect herself, but the composure that had carried her through years of live television was slipping. Her voice, instead of calm rebuttal, cracked under the weight of raw emotion. She leaned forward, her fist clenched, her words tumbling out in an uncharacteristic burst. This is exactly the problem. You think shouting slogans is the same as solving problems? You think defiance is leadership? No, it's chaos. The scream, higher, sharper than her usual timbre, was what stunned viewers. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't rhetorical. It was visceral, like a nerve exposed. A scream of frustration, of authority challenged, of control slipping away on live television. The panelists recoiled slightly, as if the sound itself had broken some unspoken code of broadcast decorum. Crockett, however, remained still. Her eyes, locked on Maddow, her hands calmly folded on the desk. Not a twitch of fear, not a flicker of uncertainty. Her poise in that moment became her weapon. When Crockett finally responded, her voice was even quieter than before, and yet it carried farther than Maddow's scream. You don't get to call my truth chaos. Chaos is when families are destroyed by a system that pretends to care, but never shows up. Chaos is when injustice is analyzed to death while people bleed in the streets. What I bring isn't chaos, Rachel, it's clarity, and that clarity terrifies people who've built careers around controlling the narrative. The words rippled. Through the room, a pause followed, heavy and unrelenting, as if even the air itself had frozen. Maddow's face flushed, her hands trembling slightly against the desk. She opened her mouth, then closed it, caught in a rare moment of speechlessness, and then the outside world erupted. Twitter timelines flooded instantly with clips of Crockett's line. Hashtags like hashtag truth without fear and hashtag Crockett clapback trended within minutes. Screenshots of Maddow's scream paired with Crockett's unshaken calm became instant memes. TikTok users began looping the moment, setting Crockett's words to music like they were lyrics in an anthem. Jasmine Crockett just ended Rachel Maddow's career in 10 seconds flat. One viral tweet declared amassing hundreds of thousands of likes in under an hour. Another post read, "This is history. Remember this night." Inside the studio, the ripple effect was visible. Panelists sat rigidly, unsure how to steer the conversation back into safer waters. One cleared his throat, only to be drowned out by the weight of what had just unfolded. The host, the unshakable gatekeeper of liberal discourse, had lost control not just of the conversation, but of her composure. Meanwhile, Crockett's presence grew larger than the stage itself. Her calmness read not as passivity but as dominance. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to wave her arms. Her words had already lodged themselves in the cultural bloodstream. Maddow attempted one last retort, her voice trembling as she tried to regain footing. That's not how serious politics works. But she cut herself off, realizing the futility of pressing further. Crockett had already won the moment. Scream, the unraveling, had sealed it. Crockett leaned back in her chair, her eyes steady, a faint but unmistakable expression of resolve etched across her face. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The silence around her spoke louder than anything she could have added. Across America, households sat stunned. Some cheered, others replayed the moment again and again, unable to believe they had just witnessed one of the most dramatic on-air meltdowns in recent memory. It wasn't just entertainment. It felt like a cultural shift. Maddow's scream wasn't just her own. It symbolized the frustration of an establishment voice being overtaken by a rising one. Crockett's poise, meanwhile, became a rallying cry for a generation tired of waiting politely for permission to speak. Even Maddow's fiercest fans couldn't ignore what had unfolded. Comment sections flooded with conflicting reactions, some defending Maddow's passion, others admitting the scream was a misstep, still more hailing Crockett as the new voice of unapologetic truth. The debate wasn't confined to the studio anymore. It had spilled into the bloodstream of the nation. And yet, as powerful as that moment was, it was only the spark. Because what happened next took this clash beyond the studio walls. The moment Rachel Maddow's scream reverberated across the airwaves, the internet did what it always does. It seized the moment, it magnified it, and turned it into something larger than life. Within minutes, hashtags surged into the trending bar. Hashtag MADDOW meltdown. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag truth without fear. Clips from the exchange flooded Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, even Facebook groups that rarely agreed on anything. Each platform became its own battleground of commentary, remix, and reaction. Memes emerged at lightning speed. One featured Maddow's wide-eyed scream juxtaposed with Crockett's calm stare, captioned, "Volume versus Vision." Another transformed Crockett's words, "You analyze injustice." I live it into a bold graphic over protest footage already circulating like a digital rally poster. TikTok users layered her voice over clips of marches, courtrooms, and fiery sunsets, turning the line into a soundtrack for defiance. Influencers jumped in immediately, progressive YouTuber declared. "This is the energy we've been waiting for." Crockett didn't just hold her ground, she owned it. On Instagram Live, an activist with nearly 2 million followers replayed the scream on loop, laughing between commentary. This is what happens when the establishment meets the truth. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist. By the following evening, monologues were filled with punchlines like, "Rachel Maddow went from host to roast in 10 seconds flat." But it wasn't just entertainers who amplified the shockwaves. Rival politicians seized the moment for their own narratives. Conservative pundits gleefully declared it proof that liberal media was eating its own. Progressives, however, saw something different. A handful of rising Democratic figures praised Crockett for bringing unfiltered authenticity to a conversation too often dominated by elitism. One senator tweeted, "Whether you agree with her or not, you can't deny Crockett showed what fearless representation looks like." Yet perhaps the most telling reactions came from ordinary Americans. In living rooms, break rooms, and college dorms, people replayed the clip not once, but over and over. One mother wrote on Facebook, "I've watched politics my whole life, but I've never felt seen until I heard Crockett say those words." A college student tweeted, "This is why young people don't trust the gatekeepers. Crockett spoke for us." A retired veteran posted a TikTok saying, "Finally someone called out the comfort zone politics that keep us stuck." That was courage. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Maddow, once untouchable, now found her reputation questioned in ways it hadn't been before. Commentators debated whether her scream was a momentary lapse of composure or a symbol of a deeper flaw, an ability of establishment voices to adapt to a new era. Editorials ran headlines like, "Has Rachel Maddow met her match? The Night Authority lost to authenticity?" Meanwhile, Crockett's star rose with a velocity few could have predicted. Overnight, her social media following exploded. Interviews were requested from outlets that had never before uttered her name. Activist groups quoted her words in newsletters. Young progressives began circulating digital petitions, urging party leaders to elevate her voice within the movement. It wasn't just admiration, it was momentum. Still, beneath the memes, the hashtags, the late-night jokes, something deeper simmered. Viewers sensed that this wasn't just another viral moment destined to fade into the endless scroll of internet culture. It carried the texture of something more, an undercurrent of generational change, of frustration boiling over, of truth breaking through carefully curated narratives. Crockett hadn't simply scored points in a debate. She had cracked the image of invincibility that Maddow had carried for years. In bars and cafes, strangers debated the meaning of it all. Some argued Maddow's scream showed her passion, proof she still cared deeply about the issues. Others countered that passion wasn't the same as losing control, that Crockett's composure reflected the new kind of leadership people were hungry for. The country was divided on interpretation, united on one truth. Everyone was talking about it. Cable news, desperate to reclaim the narrative, replayed the moment endlessly. Panels of analysts offering their takes. But the more they dissected it, the more the viral clip grew beyond their reach. It belonged to the people now, to the endless loop of retweets and shares and stitched reactions. Crockett's words weren't just replayed, they were adopted, personalized, repeated as if they belonged to every viewer who had ever felt dismissed. Rachel Maddow remained on air. Still a formidable presence, still commanding respect. But the aura of untouchability was fractured. For the first time in years, her dominance looked fragile. And Crockett, with nothing but composure and conviction, had made that fracture visible to millions. And yet, beyond the memes, there was a deeper lesson waiting to be drawn. Jasmine Crockett didn't linger in the glow of her viral triumph. When asked in interviews about the clash, she pivoted away from the scream, away from the spectacle towards something larger. "This was never about me versus Rachel," she explained softly, her tone steady yet resolute. "It was about truth versus arrogance, representation versus elitism, and the reminder that every person, no matter where they come from, has the right to speak without being dismissed." Her words reframed the entire event. What millions had watched as a viral meltdown, Crockett repositioned as a parable, a story of what happens when the polished establishment collides with raw authenticity. Maddow's unraveling wasn't just a media moment. It became a warning about the fragility of authority built on exclusion. Crockett's.com, by contrast, emerged as a beacon of courage for those who had been told too many times to stay quiet, to wait their turn, to defer to power. It was a reversal as old as storytelling itself. The giant stumbling, the underdog rising. Maddow, the titan of liberal commentary, had dismissed a newcomer with the confidence of someone who had weathered 100 debates. But giants fall not because of size, Crockett reminded audiences, but because of the cracks they refused to acknowledge. "The moment you believe you're untouchable," she told a rally days later, "is the moment you've already lost touch with the people you claim to represent." Audiences cheered not just because they saw Maddow falter, because Crockett had transformed that stumble into a message that spoke directly to them. She was not claiming victory for herself, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or silenced. Her refrain became simple yet resonant. Dignity is louder than arrogance. Authenticity is stronger than performance. And truth will always outlast volume. This framing hit deeper than the memes and late-night jokes. It reminded viewers that the spectacle wasn't the story. The story was the courage it takes to speak when you know the room is against you. The story was the quiet power of authenticity in an age when polish and spin often drown out sincerity. The story was about millions of ordinary people seeing themselves reflected in Crockett's refusal to bow. In that reframing, Maddow's scream became almost symbolic. It was the sound of authority straining under the weight of its own arrogance, the echo of a world where gatekeepers believe they can control the narrative. Crockett's poise, by contrast, became the embodiment of a new kind of politics, messy, real, unapologetic. And then came the crescendo. Standing before a crowd that had gathered not just to see her, but to see themselves in her, Crockett delivered the line that would cement the lesson, because when one voice dares to rise, she declared, pausing as the silence stretched into anticipation, millions more feel empowered to follow. The audience erupted. But the impact wasn't just in the cheers, it was in the recognition that this wasn't rhetoric. It was lived truth. Crockett's rise was proof that the walls guarding elitism could crack, and when they did, the light pouring through was enough to ignite a movement. Rachel Maddow's downfall wasn't celebrated as humiliation. Necessary reminder, even the most seasoned voices must listen or risk being drowned out by the very people they claim to champion. And Jasmine Crockett's ascent wasn't framed as a personal conquest, but as an invitation for anyone watching, anywhere in the country, to claim their place in the conversation. This was no longer about a scream. It was about a shift, a passing of the torch, a moment where authenticity pierced through performance and dignity humbled arrogance. And in that moment, every viewer who had ever wondered if their voice mattered felt a surge of possibility. The story had become bigger than Maddow, bigger than Crockett. It had become America's story, the eternal struggle between those who cling to control and those who rise to challenge it. And as the echoes of that night lingered, one thing was clear. The clash wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a movement hungry for courage, hungry for truth, and hungry for voices, unafraid to rise. The moment that began with Rachel Maddow's scream and Jasmine Crockett's clapback has already become legend. What millions witnessed wasn't just a clash on live television night, was the crystallization of a larger truth. Arrogance can dominate for a moment, but courage, steady, unapologetic, authentic, lasts far longer. Crockett's poise in the face of dismissal didn't just silence a panel, it ignited a movement. She reminded every viewer that power is not measured in volume or polish, but in the conviction to speak when it matters most. Maddow's mistake was not in questioning, it was in underestimating. And that miscalculation gave rise to a moment so raw, so undeniable, that it leapt from the studio to the streets, the screens, and the hearts of millions. Now the story belongs to us, because this isn't only Jasmine Crockett's victory. A reminder that your voice, too, carries weight. That when you refuse to shrink, when you dare to confront arrogance with truth, you change the room and sometimes the world. So here's the challenge. Don't let this moment fade as just another viral clip. Share it. Amplify it. Use it as proof that dignity is louder than arrogance, and that courage can ripple far beyond a single stage. And if you believe in that message, if you want more stories where truth prevails over elitism, or authenticity triumphs over performance, then join us. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment with your own story of standing up when it wasn't easy. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters. Because when one voice rises, millions more follow. And tonight, that next voice might be yours.